Imagine building and deploying your own full stack website using React. Imagine walking into a web development interview and instead of having to face a series of technical questions, you come prepared with your very own full stack React application that you can show off to your interviewer. Now, that is going to make a great impression and could be the advantage you're looking for in landing the job of your dreams. So the question is, are you up for the challenge? In this course, we will be going through the step-by-step process of creating a full-stack application with React, Node.js, Express, and MongoDB. This setup is commonly referred to as the MERN stack. By the end of this tutorial, you'll have a fully functional website, which is something that you can show off to your friends and potential employers. So let's jump in and start building a full-stack React application. Before we get started, there are a few concepts that would be very helpful for you to know because I won't be mentioning them explicitly in this tutorial. The first thing is a basic knowledge of JavaScript syntax. Obviously, since in order to use React, you have to use a lot of JavaScript, it's going to be very helpful for you if you are already familiar with JavaScript syntax. And if you're not, you're more than welcome to try and follow along anyway, mostly just because JavaScript syntax is fairly straightforward. But I would highly recommend that at some point you brush up on your JavaScript syntax. Now, besides this, it would also be helpful for you to know a lot of the basics of React, or at least be familiar with basic React syntax, since we'll obviously be using React pretty heavily in this tutorial. Again, you're more than welcome to just follow along and learn as you go. But if you want to be more prepared, you can always go back and take a look at the basics of React. And finally, since we'll be making some network requests in this course, it would also be helpful for you to know, to have a knowledge of fundamental network concepts, things like making network requests and basic terminology like clients and servers. If you don't have this, once again, you're more than welcome to just continue on with the tutorial. Continue with the tutorial. Just know that there may be certain things I'll say or do that you won't understand completely. So anyway, that's really all that you need to know in order to get started with this tutorial. Now that we have discussed this, let's jump right in. So to get started here, we are going to be building the front end of our blog site using React. Now, you may be wondering why we chose to use React instead of just creating our site using basic HTML, CSS, and JavaScript. React has a lot of advantages over hand coding a site. The main advantage is that it makes creating a website much simpler and even faster without taking away any of the fine-grained control from the programmer. So, as you'll see, it allows us to create modular, reusable components that can be arranged into fully functional website. Now you may be wondering why you choose to use React over a platform like WordPress or Wix or Squarespace, which allows you to create a website in many cases without writing any code. First of all, since this tutorial is aimed primarily at developers, if you want to create a blog and you are not already a fairly strong developer, I actually would recommend that you use one of these platforms instead of React. It'll ultimately end up being much more difficult for you in the long run if you try to create a code-based site with React and still struggle with basic coding. So all that being said, if you do choose to use React, and if you are watching this tutorial, I'm going to assume that you are very interested in using React. React is a fantastic tool to programmers who want to create basically any type of web application. So with that knowledge, let's move on and see how we can quickly set up a React-powered front end for our site. So now that we are a little bit more familiar with React and why it's going to be so helpful in creating a front end for our full stack application, the next thing that we are going to do is to see how to create a new React application. Now, the fastest way to set up a React app from scratch is by using a generator. And the one that we are going to use is here is going to be um, it's called Vite. So what we are going to do here is I'm going to start off with this directory here. And if you don't have the same files as I have here, don't worry too much about it. These are just basic files from the GitHub repo that I'm going to use. You can start with an empty directory if you want. And inside that empty directory, what we are going to do is open up a terminal, which you can do in Visual Studio. And inside this terminal, you're going to run the following command. You're going to run npm create, and then you're going to say wheat at the rate. And the recommended way of doing this for production purposes is to say latest at latest, because that will be using the latest stable version to do this. But in order to make sure that you can actually use the exact same version, and in order to make sure all of the commands that I'm going to be showing from here on out will work with you, I'm going to suggest that you use the same version that I am using, which is 5.5.2. So you're going to run this command npm create read at the rate 5.5.2. And this is going to ask you some questions. It's going to ask, first of all, is it okay to proceed? And I'm going to say yes. And then it's going to ask us what we want to name our project. We can name this whatever we want, but in order to really emphasize the differentiation between the front end and the back end, I'm going to call this front end for the project name. The next thing I'm going to ask, the next thing it's going to ask us is to select a framework. And I'm going to select React here. You can actually create apps of plenty of other types, such as Vue application, Svelte application, just a vanilla JavaScript application if you want to. But obviously, since this is a tutorial about full stack React, we are going to choose React. Next thing it's going to ask us is if we want to use TypeScript or JavaScript. Just to keep things simple here, I'm going to use JavaScript, but if you are a fan of TypeScript, feel free to use that here instead. And now that we have done that, what Read has done for us is created this whole front-end directory with lots of useful files inside of it that make up our React project. So if you take a look inside of here, and specifically inside the source directory, you're going to see that we have a React component all ready to go called app.jsx. And if you run this application, you'll actually see what this is. It's just a basic boilerplate page that you can use to test and make sure your setup is working. Now that we have created our React app, let's actually run this thing and take a look at it in the browser. What we need to do for this is, first of all, install all of the dependencies. Vite does not do that for you, so we are going to change directories into the new front-end directory we just created. And then we are going to say npm install inside of it. That's going to install all of the npm packages that this project needs in order to run. And that's going to run for a little bit. But once it finishes, we should be able to run our project. And the way that we do that in a project created using Vite is by saying npm run dev. And once again, make sure that you're running this inside this front-end directory, not in the surrounding directory. So I'm going to hit enter, and sure enough, that will start up our app. And as you can see here, it's running on localhost 5173. We see the new React application that the read script generated. It's got read plus React. It's got the two icons and they have this neat little hover effect. And if you click on this button, it keeps track of how many times it's been clicked. So the last thing that we are going to do here is I'd like to demonstrate something for you that Read does for us. That is going to make this application much easier to build. So if we go back into our editor here, we're going to open up app.jsx, which is the component that we are seeing here. And let's just make a change to some part of this. You can really change any of the text that you want to change on this page. I'm going to add after this message that says edit app.jsx and save to test HMR. I'm just going to say just did. And if we save this file and go back to our app running in the browser, we see that that's automatically updated. This is known as HMR or hot module reloading, which basically just means that our app can update to incorporate changes without restart. It's, as I said, going to make this much easier to build our front end. So now that we have got a very basic React app up and running, let's start creating the pages for our blog site. The first thing that we are going to do here, because it's going to make it easier for us, is we're going to create a new folder in our source directory for our front end. And we are going to call that folder pages. There's no requirement that we have to put our page components inside a directory called pages in a React app. But ultimately, it's just going to make it easier for us, in this case, to keep track of where everything is. So let's create a new file in there. And we're going to call this file homepage.jsx. And this is obviously going to represent the homepage of our application. So let's just create a very simple page component here. It's going to look like this. We're going to say export default function homepage. And then inside the component, all we're going to do is return a simple h1 heading that says this is the home page. All right. And once again, this JSX that we are returning is what's going to be displayed whenever our page component needs to be rendered in our app. So at this point, though, our homepage component isn't going to be displayed at all because what our app is doing, if we take a look at this main.jsx file, this is what's known as the entry point for our application. In other words, this is the first file that will get executed when our React app is rendered in the browser. So in other words, when we navigate to localhost 5137, our browser is going to run this code right here in order to start rendering our app. So as we see, we have the app component being rendered, but that's about it. So what we are going to do next is we're going to go into our app component into app.jsx. We're going to remove all of the boilerplate code that it has given us. And instead, we are just going to have our app component display our single homepage component, which we can do by just starting to type homepage. And depending on your IDE, it may just complete that for you. And also add the import statement up at the top, which is really nice. And now we see import homepage from pages/homepage was already added. And this now will display our homepage. Now you'll see that we also get some red underlines for a lot of these things. And that's just because our read project is pretty strict about not having things around that aren't being used. So you may see, depending on your settings, that will actually cause your app to crash. But in this case, that's not the case. We can actually just leave those there if you want to. I'm going to remove them just because we won't be needing those for the rest of the. We'll just remove all of those like so and import them again if we need them. Cool. So at this point, our home page should be showing up. So let's go take a look at this in our browser again. Sure enough, what we see is that we have this big text saying this is the home page right in the middle of our application, which is displayed really no matter what route we are on. So the next thing that we are going to do here is, because we want our blog application to have multiple pages. For example, we want to have a list of articles on the route slash articles, and we want to be able to have maybe an about page on slash about. We need to actually add routing to our application. And that's what we are going to do next. All right. So now that we have created our home page and rendered that from our app component, as I said, the next thing we are going to do is create the other pages for our app and display those on different routes. All right. So in other words, we're going to need some sort of logic here that will look at the current path that's in the URL in our browser before deciding what to render. Now there is actually a package that does this for us already, and that is a package called React Router DOM. Now we do need to install this into our application. So what we're going to do is open up your app. You can stop it too with Control C, and we are going to say npm install React Router DOM. And in order to make sure that this is the same version as the one that I'm using, you're going to add a version on the end here. And the version we are going to use is 6.4. So if you just say React Router DOM at the rate 6.4, everything should work in pretty much the same way as what I'm going to do here. So let's just install that and make sure that you install that in the front end directory here instead of in the surrounding folder, of course. And now that we have that, the next thing we are going to do is open up the app.jsx file again. The app component, sort of the top level component in our application. And we're going to add a little bit of logic to use the React Router DOM library that we just installed. So here is what this is going to look like. We are going to start off up at the top. I recommend doing this about the local imports just to keep everything organized. We are going to say import, and we are going to import something called create browser router. And we are also going to import something called router provider from that library that we just installed, which is React Router DOM. Cool. So now that we have those two things imported, here's what this is going to look like. The first thing that we are going to do is define an array of JavaScript objects that will tell React Router DOM what pages should be displayed for each part in our application. So in other words, when we are at, let's say, localhost 5173 slash articles, what page component should we use there? If we are just at localhost 5173 slash the home route, what page should we display there and so on. So here is what this looks like. We're just going to say const routes equals, and then as I said, this is going to be an array of JavaScript objects with specific properties, and those properties are going to be path, which tells React Router DOM what path we are talking about. We'll start off with just the home route here, and then we are going to say element, and this, as I said, tells React Router DOM what to display when we are at the. So in our case, for the home route, we are going to display the home page. So we can just say element and we are going to use JSX here. And actually, instead of H1, we could just say this is the home page. If you want to, but it's generally recommended to have separate components like what we have done here in order to keep things more manageable. So we'll just remove that and say homepage like so. And now what we are going to do is we're going to take those routes and we are going to create something called a browser router with it by saying const router equals, and we're going to use that create browser router function that we imported and pass out routes to it. And the last thing we need to do is replace our homepage element here with something called router provider. And this is going to take a prop called router, and we're just going to pass that router that we created for that. Cool. So that is how we set up our application to display different pages at different routes. Let's just verify that this works with our homepage. So let's rerun our application with npm run dev. Now we are going to go back to here and we should be able to just refresh this page and it'll open that up. And sure enough, we see that homepage shows up. But if we go to some other path here, if we just type stuff after this, we'll see that throws a not found error, basically just indicating that we didn't have a specific action for that path in our routes. We didn't have a specified element that is for that path in our routes array. So let's just go back to the home route here by deleting that, and we'll see the home page again. So let's now create our other pages that our application is going to need. So here is what this is going to look like inside the pages directory. So over here in the pages directory, we're going to create a few more pages. The first one is going to be an about page. So we'll just say about page.jsx. Then we are going to create our articles list page. This is the page that's going to display all the articles that are on our website. And finally, we are going to have another file, which will be the individual article page. We'll just call it article page.jsx. And this is going to be the component, as you'll see a little bit later, that we'll use to display not just a single article, but actually each individual article when we navigate to it. I'll show you how to do that a little bit later. But for now, what we are going to do is we're just going to copy the basic setup from our homepage component here and paste it inside these files. And then, of course, we'll go back through and edit these. So this is going to become our article page. We'll change the text here to say this is the article page. For articles list, we're going to change the name of that component to, for articles list, we're going to change the name of that component to articles list page. And then this is the articles list page. And finally, we are going to go back to the about page and change this to this is the about page. And we're going to change the name of this function to about page. So now that we have all four of these pages, let's go back to our app component and add new routes for each of those. What that's going to look like is we are just going to say path, we'll do /about, and for the about page, and then we'll say element, and we'll say about page for that. Again, that was automatically imported for me. That's what I'll be doing for the rest of these pages as well. Then for the articles list page, we are going to say path that's going to be /articles. And then we are going to say element as articles list page. That was just automatically imported for me. And finally, we are going to do the individual article page. As I said, this one's going to be a little bit different than the rest of the pages, but for now, we'll just say articles slash individual. And then we'll say element and we'll say article page. Cool. So now we have 4 routes in our application instead of just one. So let's test this thing out by going back to our browser. And up here in the URL, we are just going to add slash about on the end of that URL. And sure enough, we see that that displays the about page. And if we go to slash articles, we see this is the articles list page. And if we go to slash articles slash individual, we see that displays the individual article page. Cool. So at this point, we have all of the routing set up for our pages. So the next thing that we are going to do is actually start going through and implementing each of these pages in a little bit more of an exciting way than just showing what page this is using an H1 heading. All right, so at this point, we have 4 separate pages in our blog site, but it would be nice if we could navigate between these things without having to actually type in the URLs up at the top of the browser. So what we're going to do now is we are going to create a navbar component that will be displayed on all of the pages. So the first thing that we are going to do is we're going to say new file, and we'll create a new file called navbar.jsx. And inside here, we're going to say export default function navbar, and we'll just cut right to the chase and start implementing this thing. We're going to say and use that semantic nav element here. And then inside this, we are just going to use an unordered list with list items for each of the links that we want to add up here. Now, for now, we are only going to have links for the homepage, the about page, and the articles list page. Now, for now, we are only going to have links for the homepage, the about page, and the articles list page. The article detail page, as I said, is going to be a little bit different because we'll want to make it accessible by clicking links to specific articles in the articles list. So for now, though, let's just say that we want to have a home route here. All right. We'll come back and actually add the linking capabilities to this shortly. We'll have an about page. And last but not least, we'll have an articles page. All right. And those are all just going to be list items inside of there. And that should be all we need to do. Except now we want to link each of these things to the other pages. So the way that we do this is by using React Router DOM. Is we're going to say import, and we're going to import a component called link from React Router DOM. Now, there is an important reason why we have to use this link component instead of just using a regular anchor tag in React applications. But I'll explain that in more detail once we have added this link. So what we are going to do here is inside of each of these li elements, we are just going to add a link around text, and we're going to add a prop to it called to that will determine where clicking this link will take you. So this is just a relative path here. So for the home route, we are just going to say to equals slash, and we'll want to put the home text inside that link. And then we'll do the same thing for about. What we're going to do is just say link to equals slash about. and we'll put the about text inside of there. And now for the articles list page, we are going to say that we want to link that to slash articles, and that's all we need to do there. Let's just put the articles text inside of there as well. And that should be all we need to do for now, for our navbar. Now the tricky part here is getting our navbar to show up regardless of what page is currently being displayed. So we could obviously just import navbar and add it to all our pages. That would certainly work, but that would be duplicating quite a bit of code. And what happens if we want to change the layout significantly is we would have to go through each of our pages and make the same changes in all of them. So we don't want to do that. But if we go back to our app component and just try and add our navbar above the router provider, and we will have to use a React fragment in order to make this work. Let's just say navbar slash, and React fragments look like this. We can just put opening and closing triangle brackets, and we need to put these things inside of it. React just doesn't like it when there is more than one top level element. And if you take a look at the app in your browser, you'll see that nothing is getting displayed. And if you open up the inspect window and go to console, you'll see that we are getting quite a few errors that say things like use href may only be used in the context of a router component. Now, the reason that we are seeing this is because we're not allowed to use a link component like we did in our navbar outside of a router provider here. So in other words, we can only use this thing inside elements that are being displayed by this router provider component. So what we are going to do here is, it's actually a pretty straightforward fix. We are going to actually create a layout component that will take care of displaying the things that are in common between all of the pages. So inside the source directory, we'll just create a component called layout.jsx. What we are going to do inside of there is we're just going to display that navbar here. In fact, I'm just going to copy the app component and say export default, and then we'll paste that like so. And we'll call this layout instead. And now what we're going to do is we're going to add the navbar there, which we do need to import. So let's just go back and copy that import as well. Copy that and paste it up at the top of our layout component. And instead of this router provider thing, what we are going to do is we are going to add a component from the React Router DOM library again called outlet. Now, what this outlet stands for is it basically leaves a space in the JSX of this layout component that the matching pages for the current route will be rendered into. So this outlet basically represents whatever page is currently being displayed. And and now that we have this layout, here is how we are going to modify our app component and our routes. All that we're going to do here is take all of the routes that we just created for our pages. This entire array here, we're going to assign that to a property called children inside a single top level route. So here is what that's going to look like. Inside here, we are going to create an object and we are just going to say path home route. This will cause it to apply to all of the routes in our application. Then we are going to say element and we're going to display the layout component. Remember that that layout component has the outlet inside of it. And let's just make sure that that's imported here. And now we are going to take this children property and put it inside that route definition. So we'll just paste that right there. What this is going to do now is it's going to display this layout on all the routes, and also it's going to render whatever page matches these routes inside its outlet. That's what the outlet component does. So we should go, so we should be good to go here, except we need to remove this navbar from the app component. We no longer need it there because the navbar is going to be rendered as part of our layout component. So let's remove that navbar import from app.jsx, and we should be able to go back to our browser. And sure enough, we see that we have these links. And furthermore, if you click on these, it will take you to the correct page. This isn't the best looking navbar in the world, but we'll fix that shortly. Now, going back to the question of why we had to use this link thing in the first place instead of just an anchor tag. Well, since React applications are generally going to be single page applications, meaning that even though it looks like our application has multiple pages, it's really just JavaScript logic behind the scenes swapping out the pages as the route changes. Now, because of this, there is no reason to reload the page fully as the anchor tag is designed to do. The anchor tag is actually designed to send a request to a server when it's clicked on on it to load another page, which we don't need to do in React apps. So feel free to test and see what happens if you use an anchor tag instead of a link. And what you'll see is that whenever you click on a link, the entire page will refresh, which doesn't happen here. That doesn't happen when we use that link component. So anyway, that is how to use React router links, as we all will. So anyway, that is how to use React router links as well as create an navbar. So the next thing that we are going to do here is figure out how to actually link to our final page, which is going to be the article detail page. So that's what we're going to do next. So at this point, we have a navbar that allows us to go to three of the pages in our application, but we still need to be able to access the individual article page and display multiple articles using that page. So here is how this is going to work. First of all, we need to go back to our app component and see the routes that we defined and make a slight change to the path that we defined for our article page. Instead of saying slash articles slash individual, we are going to say slash articles, and then we're going to use a colon followed by name. Now, this is what's referred to as a URL parameter or a route parameter. And basically, what this colon name thing allows us to do is catch all the routes that start with articles and have something else after them. So in our case, this could be slash article slash 123, or if it's the article's name, as you'll often see on blog sites, such as slash articles slash learn node, for example, or learn React, then this page is going to be rendered on all of those routes. Now, the really useful part about these route parameters is that we can actually see the value of this part of the path. We have called it name here, and we can call it anything you want. You could call it ID if you want to, or you could call it blog if you really wanted to. We're just calling it name because that makes the most sense. You can actually see the value of that and use it to load the appropriate article and display it in that component. So here is what this is going to look like. First of all, we are going to need a little bit of article content that we can display in our application. So I'm going to say new file and I'm going to call this article content.js. Now inside of here, what I'm going to do is just paste some text. It's just a big array of article content with mostly lorem ipsum and some creative titles such as the fastest way to learn React, things like that. How to build a node server in 10 minutes, learn MongoDB, get the idea. Cool. And notice that each one of these articles has a name property, which is basically just a shortened version, and we call this as slug. It's just a shortened version of the title, so we can get a nice readable URL. Cool. So here is what we are going to do. Now that we have the article content, let's open up our article page, and we're going to first of all take a look at the value of the name segment that we defined in our routes here. So we are going to get that value, and then we're going to use simple JavaScript logic to load the corresponding article for that. So here is what this is going to look like. We're going to go back to our article page, and the way that we access the value at this point in the URL is like this. We're going to first of all import a React hook called use params. So we'll say import use params from React router DOM. And the way that this works is we can simply call this inside a React component, and it will give us JavaScript object containing the names and values of any segments that we received in that path. So in our case, we are going to get a JavaScript object with a property called name, and the value will be whatever is at this point. So this would be name, learn React, for example. So let's do that. We are just going to say const name equals use params. And actually here we'll say const params equals use params. And then we can say const name equals params.name. Or if you want to shorten this up considerably, you can use object destructuring and just say const. And then in curly braces, name, use params. Cool. So at this point, we have the name of the article. So let's just prove this by displaying that as part of the H1 heading here. We're going to say this is the, and then we'll insert the name here, article, and that's all we need to do here. So let's just take a look and see how this works. We're going to go back to our application, and then we're just going to type in. We will add a link that will allow us to get to individual articles shortly. But for now, we're just going to type in /articles/learn React, for example. And what we should see is that it says this is learn React article. And if we change that to pretty much anything, right, we can just say /blog if we wanted to. It'll say this is the blog. So at this point, all we really need to do is, instead of just displaying the main segment from that path, we are going to use that main segment to find the corresponding article for it. And to do that, we are just going to start off by importing our articles from our article content file that we just created. So we're just exporting that as the default export. So we'll just say import articles from article content. And now we just need to find that article by saying const article equals articles dot find. We're just using JavaScript's built-in find function here, and we are going to find the article whose name property is equal to the name parameter that we just got from use params. Cool. So at this point, we have that article. So instead of displaying just a hard-coded title, we can actually display the title of the article itself by saying article dot title. And then for the content, if we take a look at the article content here, you'll see the content is just a list of paragraphs. We're just going to look through these and put each one inside a paragraph tag. So here is that. Here is what that's going to look like. And we will need the React fragments here since we'll have to have more than one top level element. So let's just place that here. And now underneath the h1 heading, we are going to say article.content.map. And for each paragraph, we are going to display, and here we can actually make this even shorter just by saying we're going to display a paragraph tag with that paragraph content inside of it. And another thing that we will want to do here is whenever you use the map function to display a list like we are doing here, you need to add a key prop to the top level element that we are displaying. This makes it much easier for React to re-render the list. And if you forget this, you might notice some very strange behavior later on. So it's a best practice to just use this key. And for the key, all we really have to use here is the paragraph text itself. So we'll just say key equals paragraph, and that should be all we need to do. Cool. So let's just test this out. We go back to our app in the browser. So if you actually type in a segment here that belongs to an article such as Learn React, you'll see that this displays the text for the article as well as the title. The text is mostly just lorem ipsum. If you want to rewrite an article yourself, feel free to go ahead and do so. But anyway, let's try this with something else. Let's try learn node, and that loads a new article here and uses the same component to display it. And finally, if we do MongoDB, that will display the MongoDB article. So that is how to use raw parameters to customize the content of a React page based on the value of one of the segments in the path. All right. Well, at this point, our individual article page is working and it's displaying the corresponding article for the URL. But we still need a way to get our individual article pages from the articles list page. So what we are going to do here is we are going to create a list that will display all of the available articles on our site. And whenever we click on one of those, it will take us to the corresponding URL for that article. So here is what this is going to look like. We are going to start off here by going to our articles list page. And let's start off here by replacing this H1 heading with just the word articles. And then underneath that, we'll need to add a React fragment here in order to separate that or in order to surround the two top level elements that we are going to be creating underneath our H1 heading. We are going to simply load all of the articles from our article content file. So we'll just say import articles from article content. And now we're just going to say articles start map. And for each article here, what we're going to do is display an H3 heading that has the article's title. So we'll just say a dot title. Underneath that, we are going to have just a text sample for the article. So maybe we'll do the first 150 characters. So here's what that's going to look like. We're just going to say P, and then we'll say a dot content. And since content is an array of paragraphs, we are going to just select the first one, and then we are going to say dot substring, and we'll get the first 150 characters by saying 0 and 150. Now, around this, in order to link each of these articles to the corresponding individual article page, we are just going to use the link component provided again by React Auto DOM to do so. So here is what that's going to look like. We're going to say import link from React router down. And down here now, we are going to surround our H3 and paragraph elements with a link that says to. And for this, what we're going to do is we're going to say slash articles slash, and then we're going to add the article's name onto the end there by saying plus a plus name, that is, and let's just put this inside curly brackets like so, and that will link to the corresponding articles page. So let's just put the h3 and paragraph elements inside that link element now. So that clicking on, so let's just put the h3 and paragraph elements inside that link element now, so that clicking on those gives that effect. We're just going to paste those in there and indent them. And we also need a key here. So we're going to say key. And for that, we're going to use the article's name, which is just a unique string that will help React keep of this during rendering. And that should be all we need to do here. So let's take a look at our articles list. And sure enough, we see, even though it's got this sort of navy blue color, I'll give you some styles a little bit later on that. You can just copy and paste to make your application look better. But what you'll see here is if you click on any one of these, sure enough, it takes you right to the corresponding article. So let's click on how to build a node server in 10 minutes. It takes us to that article. And up here, you can see that that is articles slash learn node. And let's test the learn MongoDB one. And yep, it takes us to the corresponding MongoDB article. So the last thing that we are going to do here is now that we have created this articles list, this would actually be a really helpful thing to reuse on several pages of our site. For example, if we wanted to display, a list of all of the available articles on our articles list page, but a list containing only the most popular articles on, say, homepage. Now, in order to do this, we are just going to create a separate article list component by saying new file, and we'll call this article list page.jsx. And here is what this is going to look like. We're going to say export default function articles list page. And this is actually going to take some props, and it's going to allow the parent component to pass whatever articles it wants to. So we are just going to say articles list there. So let's go back into our articles list page. And now I'm just going to copy this entire article.map thing. And I'm going to paste that and actually return that inside a React fragment from our article list component. And let's actually change the name of this to articles list just to match the name of the file. So let's just paste that inside of here. And that should be all we need to do. Besides, of course, wrap this with a React fragment. So let's cut that and paste it inside of there. And that should be all we need to do besides, of course, adjusting the indentation a little bit. And let's make sure that we import the link component here, just like we were doing. So we're going to say import link from React router DOM. And that should be all we need to do. Now, as a side note, you'll probably notice that it has a little red underline under articles.map, and that's because it wants us to add prop types. That's something that I'm actually going to skip now, just in the interest of time. But you can feel free to add a prop types validation for this articles prop if you want to. So now, right now that we have put all the, so now, right now that we have put all of the logic inside our articles list component, we can just go back into our articles list page, and instead of having the link here, we can just remove that. We're going to import our articles list component, and we are going to display that here by saying articles list, and we're going to pass our articles that we imported from article content as the articles prop here. So we'll say articles equals articles, and that should be all we need to do. So let's just make sure that didn't change anything by going back to our browser, and we should be able to go to articles, and we should see the exact same thing as what we had before. So anyway, that is how to implement the articles list page and link to each of the individual article pages from it. All right, so at this point, we have 4 working pages and 1 page for our individual article page that serves the purpose of multiple pages just because of how it uses the React route parameters. So the last thing that we are going to do here is we're going to figure out how we can handle when the user goes to a route that we don't have page for. So right now, you'll notice that if you just go to a route that we don't have a path defined for in our routes array, it will give us this rather ugly, unhandled, thrown error message. Now that we would like to do here, now what we would like to do here is something a little bit more graceful, at least display something like 404 page not found or that link is broken, something like that. So here is how you can do that. It's actually pretty straightforward using React Router. So we are going to go back to app.jsx, and all we really need to do here is in this routes object or this layout route, we are going to add another property called error element. This is just like the regular element property, except this will only get displayed if there is an error actually finding or displaying the page for that route. So in our case, let's just start off here by displaying a very simple H1 heading that says, oh no. All right, that's all we are going to do. And if we go back to here now, sure enough, we will see that whenever we go to a path that we don't have a corresponding page for, it will display this page. So all we need to do now is just make this page a little bit more indent. And we are going to do that by adding a new file to our pages directory called notfoundpage.jsx. And we'll say export default function not found page. And inside here, all we are going to do is we are going to display an H1 heading that says page not found. And then what we're going to do is we are just going to display a little message underneath this saying something like the link you followed to get here must be broken. Something like that. You can obviously change the exact wording of this if you want to. It's your blog after all. So now that we have this not found page, we are just going to display that instead of this oh no element. So let's just change error element here to not found page, like so. That should be all we need to do. So let's give this another try. And sure enough, if we go back here, it says page not found. The link you followed to get here must be broken. And we can set this right. If we go back to one of our routes, and sure enough, we're all good now. So that's how to add a not found page when we go to a route that we don't have something for. But what happens if the user follows slash articles slash and then a name that we don't have an article for, such as blog? Well, as you'll see, that works as well. The nice part about that error element property that we just saw is that it will render this element whenever some sort of error occurs. So in this case, the error that occurred in our article page was we tried to find an article that didn't exist, and accessing the title caused our application to produce an error, which was caught by React Router, and we simply displayed the not found page. Now we need not always display the not found page when there is an error in our application. But for now, that works pretty well. So I'm going to leave it this way. And the last thing that we are going to do next is we are going to see how to add some simple styles to our application. At this point, we have a fully functional front end, except that our app doesn't really look very good. The default styles provided by Weed doesn't really match up with our blog site's needs. So what I'm going to recommend you do is, if you want your app to look like this, please feel free to copy and paste the styles. You can simply take a look at the index.css file and the app.css file, and you'll want to just replace whatever is currently in both of those with the code that I have here. So that's going to change these styles pretty significantly. It's going to make it look maybe a little bit more appropriate to a blog site. But I also want to show you how these styles work in React project setup with Vue. Well, first of all, we have this index.css file, and this is where you are going to put all of your global styles. So any styles that you want to apply to your entire application can go in here. Inside app.css, we have anything that's specific to the app component itself. And the way that this works is if you open up app.jsx, you'll see that we are importing app.css just by saying import dot slash app.css. Now, what that does, now, what that does is it'll take the styles that are in that file and apply it to this component. So having a specific CSS file for component is a great way to add unique styles for a given component. But in order to make it much easier for you, I just put all the styles into index.css and app.css. So that's all you'll need to do in order to get your app to look like mine going forward. And with that, we have pretty much completed our front end for now, at least until we need to load data from our backend. But first, we need to create a backend, which is what we are going to do next. So now that we got our client side working clearly, it's time to start building the backend of our blog site. So, and to do this, we're going to use Node.js. Now, you've probably already heard about Node.js by now, and it's very important to us here because it allows us to write our backend in JavaScript instead of using PHP or Python or Java or some other language besides JavaScript. It used to be that in order to be a full stack developer, you had to be fairly fluent in more than one programming language. But with Node.js, as you'll see, which has become an incredibly popular runtime since it was released, our entire web application can be written in JavaScript, which is great news for us JavaScript developers. So now there are many different NPM libraries that can be used to write Node.js servers. And the one that we are going to use here in this course is going to be Express. Now, Express is a great choice for us here because it's unopinionated, as you can see on this website. That's one of the first words that it mentions there, besides fast. But besides that, it's also very easy to get started with this. It's well documented, and there is a ton of third-party add-ons that we can use to extend its functionality. So without further delay, let's use these technologies and get started with creating the backend for our application. So to get started creating a backend for our app with Node.js and Express, let's start off here by creating a new directory outside our front-end directory. Since our front-end code is in directory called frontend, we are just going to create a new folder here and we'll call it backend. Again, this is really meant to emphasize the difference between these two things and help you see how they fit together. In practice, you can always figure out ways to put these files together in the same directory, but that's usually requires a little bit of setup. So we're not going to do that here now. So inside our new directory, let's get started by creating a new npm package, basically telling npm that we want this to be its own thing. And we are going to do that by changing directories into our backend directory. So what we need to do now, as I said, in order to tell npm that we want this to be its own self-contained package or project, is we're going to say npm init minus y. And what that's going to do is create this package.json file for us. This thing has a variety of purposes, as we'll see, but one of those purposes is to keep track of basic information about this project, including things like its name, its dependencies. And very shortly, we'll see how to use these scripts here in order to automate some of the tasks. So now that we have done that, the next thing we are going to do is, because Express is not built into our Node.js runtime automatically, it's a separate library. We're going to install it by saying npm install Express. And we are going to hit enter, and that will install that library for us. So now we have pretty much everything we need to get started. So let's get started with writing some code. We are going to create a new folder here called source, just src. And inside this directory, we are going to create a new file called server.js. Now, again, it's not required to create the source directory, but in practice, it really helps to keep the actual business logic of our application separate from some of the setup files and other files that, such as these package.json file. So inside here, what we are going to do is we're going to set up a simple Express application, and this is pretty straightforward to do. What we are going to do is just say import Express from Express, and then we're going to create a new Express app by calling this thing, which is that function like this. We're going to say const app equals Express. And now that we have done that, we're going to create a simple endpoint here. I'll describe what an endpoint is in much more detail shortly, but for now, just know that an endpoint is a path that we can send a request to, and it will send some sort of data or message back. So here is what this is going to look like. We're going to say app.get, and we're just going to say /hello as the first argument to this. I'll describe what that actually does very shortly as well. And then for the second argument, we are actually going to pass a function that takes two arguments called request and response. We'll see those in action shortly as well. And then inside this function, what we're going to do is we're going to say response.send, and we're going to send back a message that says hello. This is probably one of the simplest endpoints it's possible to create. So think of it as the Express version of a Hello World program. And the last thing that we are going to do here is we're going to start our server up, which will enable it to actually respond to requests using the endpoints that we have defined. Just follow along with me here if that doesn't quite make sense yet. We're going to say app.listen. And the first argument that we can pass to this thing is the port number that we want our app to listen on. We're just going to say 8000 there, and then we're going to have a callback function here that will be called once our server is successfully listening. And inside here, generally, what you'll do is just say console.log and print out something like server is listening on port 8000. And that should be all that we need to do here in order to create an Express application. So let's try running this thing. And the way that this is going to work is you just need to open up a terminal inside your backend directory. Make sure you're inside this directory, or you'll get an error when you try and do this. So we're going to say node and then the path to our file. So source slash server.js, and make sure you are running this from inside the backend directory. If you're not, it will give you an error. And by the way, this node command, what that does is it simply executes the code inside any Node.js JavaScript file in a similar way to how opening up a JavaScript file in a browser will execute the file. So let's hit enter. And what you'll see here is that this will actually give us an error because of this import syntax that we have used up here. Now, it used to be that you had to use another tool to actually convert this more modern version of JavaScript into an older version of JavaScript. But now all we have to do is go into our package.json and we have to add a property called type module, and that will allow that to work properly. So let's try running this again. And sure enough, we'll see that our server is listening on port 8000. If you open up the browser and go to localhost 8000, you'll see this error here. First of all, that says cannot get slash. Just ignore that for now. What we are going to do is add slash hello to the end of this URL. And what we'll see is that it sends back hello. So this is the message that we sent back inside that endpoint. So again, essentially, what's going on here when we define an endpoint is we're saying that when our application receives a request, when our server receives a request on a given path, such as slash hello, the function that we define should be executed. And as part of that function, we can choose to send something back, such as this message here. So that's the basic idea of creating endpoints in Express. So we'll be creating lots more here for different pieces of functionality that we want to add to our blog application. But anyway, that's the basics of setting up an Express server. All right. So now that we have set up the basic backend for our application, as we move forward developing this backend, it's going to be really important for us to have an easy and reliable way to test it. So we have just been typing the URL into our browser, but for some of the more complicated operations that we want to implement, this isn't going to be quite good enough. So now what a lot of people do to test their backend is to develop a feature on their front end and then use that to test the backend. But in practice, that is generally not quite as easy as developing the backend first and then building the front end functionality later. So a tool that can be used and that's used by many developers, as you see here, for this sort of backend first testing is a free piece of software called Postman. So, and in case of and in case if you don't have Postman or have never worked with it before, you can download it by going to postman.com/downloads. So it should just come up with your operating system and it should be easy to set up. So once you have downloaded it and set it up, you should see a screen that looks like this. And what we are going to do here is open up a new tab, and you can start off here by sending the simple GET request to the hello endpoint that we just defined. So all we need to do here now is click the send button, and as we'll see, that gives us the hello response that we defined in that endpoint. Now, one of the biggest advantages of using Postman over testing in a browser is the fact that we have a lot more control over the request that we are sending. So instead of just sending a GET request, which is just a specific type of request, usually used for loading data, we can also send things like POST requests, which are usually used for creating data on the server, such as adding comments, as well as see a little, as well as doing some other operations, as we'll see later in a little bit later. So in order to test this out, what we are going to do is we are just going to send a post request to /hello. And what we'll see is that we actually get back this HTML error from our Express server saying that we don't have an endpoint defined for that combination of method. Post, get, those are HTTP methods, and post, get, those are HTTP methods, and the path. So if you go back to our server, we can actually define another method by opening up server.js, and just like how we said app.get, which is defined as a get endpoint, an endpoint that will respond to get requests, we can say app.post/hello, and that we can add a callback, and then we can add a callback function here with again request and response, and then we'll say response.send, and we'll say something like hello from a post endpoint. And here, let's also say hello from a get endpoint in our get hello endpoint. And what we'll actually need to do first is restart our server in order for these changes to take effect. We'll see a little bit later on how we can have this automatically restart in response to changes, but for now, we are going to do it manually. So you can do that by pressing Control C. That will stop the server, and then we're going to restart it. So let's go back to Postman now and test this. We're going to send a post request to /hello now. And sure enough, we see hello from a post endpoint. And then we change this to get and click send. We'll see that that's activated the functionality for the other endpoint and sent back the message hello from a get endpoint. All right. Now, one last thing that we're going to do here before we start creating real endpoints for our application is we're going to allow our endpoints to have access to something called request body. So essentially, whenever a front end such as a React application, or in this case, just a simple application like Postman, whenever one of these clients sends a request to our server, it's allowed to include extra data in the form of a request body. As we can specify this by clicking on, and we can specify this by clicking on body here, and then we can actually type out a JSON request body, essentially just by selecting raw and then the JSON dropdown. And here is what this is going to look like. We can just say something like name, and let's rewrite our endpoint here. So we can say hello with the name of the person who sent it. So I'm going to use my name here. You can obviously use yours. And the way that we can access this back on our server is by saying hello, and then we will have to insert that. But the way that we have to do this is by saying request.body.name. So this request.body thing is going to be automatically populated by with a little bit more setup. And as you'll see now, whatever data we include in this JSON request body, it should be available in the body. But in order to make this work, we are going to add one more line after creating our app and before defining our endpoints. And that line is going to be app.use. And then we're going to say express.json with parentheses after it. And that simply tells our request application that if it sees a request body, it should add it to this request.body object. So that should be all we need to do. Let's just test this one more time by restarting our server. And now, if we go back to Postman and click send with that request body, let's send a post request here. All right, we see it says hello and then the name from a post endpoint. And if you change that to something else, if you were to change this to Bob, for example, and click send, we'll see that that will change the response that we get. Now, this is a very simple example, but as you'll see shortly, we are going to use this same method for allowing users to do things like create comments and upvotes, upvoting articles for our blogs. So anyway, that is the basics of defining and testing endpoints with different methods using Express and Postman. So the next thing that we're going to do here is we're going to start creating real endpoints for our applications. At this point, we have seen how to use post requests to carry extra information in the form of a JSON object along with the requests that we send to our server. Now, this is generally the best way to add more complex information to our requests, but there are actually several other ways to do so. So before we move on to implementing things like upvoting or comments for our blog site, let's take a sort of backward look at a concept that we learned when implementing the article page for our front end. So you may recall that for each of our article pages, we simply use the same component and then by sending a request to slash articles slash followed by the article's unique ID or name, such as learn node or learn react, we were able to populate the page component with different data. And we did this using something called route parameters or URL parameters. Now, as a matter of fact, Express also allows us to use route parameters, and this is useful in many cases. For example, if you want to, let's say, add a comment to an article, we might send a post request to slash articles slash whatever the name of that article might be slash comments. I'll discuss the exact structure of this part a little bit later, and we might want to include the info for that comment. So the name of the poster, the comment text, things like that in the request body. And in this case, the ID or the name that we are using here would be a route parameter, but as I said, it will be handled by Express in this case instead of by React, as we'll see now. So in order to get a little bit more comfortable with these route parameters in Express and how they work, let's do a pretty simple example before we jump into working with different article data. So let's try and send the request to slash hello slash someone's name here. And let's see how we can actually get the value of this segment inside an Express endpoint. And just to make this a little bit more obvious what's going on, let's delete the request body. We're just going to say none here for the body tab. So that we're sure that we're just going to say none here for the body tab so that we are sure that it's actually coming from the route parameter here. And what we're going to do is we're going to make a get request endpoint that will respond when we say slash hello slash something. and it'll actually use the value in the second segment as the person's name. So in order to do this, here is what that syntax is going to look like. First of all, we are going to add another get endpoint here. We'll say app.get slash hello and then slash, and the syntax is actually identical to what we saw in React. We're just going to say slash hello slash colon name. And then for the function here with request and response as arguments. And by the way, we already saw two ways in which we could use these arguments. The first was to access the request body where we said request.body.name. The second way was by saying response.send, which sent the response. So in general, the request argument here will contain data about the requests, such as the method that was used, as well as things like extra data in the form of request bodies or route parameters. And the response here is generally used to customize the response that we send back to the client from the server. So in our case here, all we have to do, we don't have to do anything special like what we did up here with app.use express.json. In order to use route parameters, all we have to do is say response.send, and then we'll say hello, and we will insert the name, which we can access by saying request.params. Instead of request.body, we say request.params. And then we use the name of the segment that we put here as the actual name for the property in request.params. So if we had called this hello slash colon first name, for example, we would just have to say request.params.first name instead. So let's just keep it at name and request.parameters params.name. Request.params.name. And what we're going to do here is we just need to send a get request to slash hello slash something. We can put whatever we want here, and that is going to give us a response where it sort of echoes back that value. But first, we need to restart the server. So let's restart it manually again. We'll take a look at another way that we can have this restart automatically shortly. And let's go back to Postman now and click send. Sure enough, we see that that echoes back the value that we put in here. So let's change this to slash hello slash express. And if we click send, sure enough, it will say hello express. All right. So what we are going to do shortly is we're going to actually use the value that's here, such as if we say learn node to allow ourselves to do things like load data for a specific article and also do things like add comments to a specific article. But that's basic mechanics behind doing that is working with simple route parameters like what we just learned here. But that's the basic mechanics behind doing that is working with some simple route parameters like what we just learned here. Well, now that we have seen some basic examples of how an Express server works, as well as the most important parts that we are going to use in our server here, such as route parameters and request bodies, let's make our server do something a little bit more relevant to our blog. So what we want here is for users to be able to upvote our articles so that we can help other users see which articles are the most popular or the most helpful. Now, in order to do this, we're going to, of course, need to add some code to our backend. And the first thing that we are going to do for that is we're going to create sort of a fake in-memory database for our server, which will keep track of the upvotes for our articles. Now, later on, we're going to actually add a real database with MongoDB to our server. But for now, just to keep things simple, we are going to just use a JavaScript array to make this happen. And what that's going to look like is up here above where we create our Express server. we're going to say const article info equals, and then what we're going to do is just create a simple array. And each one of these things is just going to be a JavaScript object that keeps track not only of the upvotes for each article, but also we'll use it to keep track of comments for each article. To start off though, let's just say upvotes 0, and we'll do that for all three of our articles. And in addition, we also need to keep track of which article each of these upvotes counts belongs to. So we're just going to say something like article name, and then we'll put the article name, write that route parameter, write that route parameter that we used in our React app as the value for that. So article name, learn node. The next one's going to be article name, and this is going to be learn React. And then I believe I had another one called article name, and that was MongoDB. Cool. So at this point, we have just these three JavaScript objects that keep track of some important data for each article. And what we are going to do next is we're going to create an endpoint that will allow users to actually upvote these articles. Therefore, changing this upvotes count by sending request to a specific endpoint. So what I'm going to do here, you can feel free to just comment these hello endpoints out, or you can even leave them around for reference. But in order to clean things up a little bit, I'm just going to remove these. And for this upvote endpoint, what we're going to do is we're going to say app.post. This is a post endpoint because we're actually creating something new. We're creating a new upvote. You could, I suppose, use a put request instead, but if you don't know what that is, don't worry too much about it. We're going to say app.post. And for the URL here, we are going to say /API. We're going to start all of our API routes, all of our server routes here with /API for reasons that will become clear after the course, later in the course. And then we're going to say /articles/:name. That's going to be the name of the article that we want to upvote, and then /upvote. All right. So now for the function, which you can do an arrow function for this as well. It doesn't have to be a function using the function keyword. We can just say request response with an arrow after it. Inside here, what we're going to do is we're going to use the value of this route parameter, find the corresponding article, and increment the number of upvotes that it has. So what this is going to look like is we're going to say const article equals article info dot find, and we're going to find the article whose name equals the name route parameter in the request. So we're going to say request dot params dot name. All right, and that should give us an article. We'll all right that should give us an article. We'll add a little bit of logic later on to handle what happens if there wasn't an article that with that name. So, but what we are going to do now is we're just going to say article, and we'll say dot upvotes. We are going to increment that by 1. Good. So now all we have to do is send back a response. And in order to just make this a little bit more interactive for us as we are testing it, what we are going to do right now is we are just going to send back the new count of upvotes for that article. So here is what this is going to look like. We're going to say response.send, and for this string we're going to say something like success, and then we'll say the article and we'll insert the article name here by saying request start param start name, and then we'll say now has, and then we'll say article dot upvotes. All right, there we go. And we'll add upvotes to it. Cool. So that should be all we need to do for that endpoint. So again, we are just getting the value of the route parameter. We are finding the article that corresponds to that, and we are incrementing its number of upvotes by 1. So let's test this thing out by restarting our server. And if we go back to Postman and send a post request to /API/articles, and we'll upvote learn node here because we're working on node here, and then we'll say /upvote. And if we send that request, we should see that each time we click this, it's incrementing the number of upvotes. Now, something to be aware of here is that if you restart your server now, that will actually reset the count to 0 because because of the fact that this is an in-memory database. So that's why we are going to add MongoDB a little bit later, because it will allow us to actually persist the data for our application. But we'll get to that in a bit. For now, we have successfully completed an endpoint for upvoting articles using route parameters. All right. So now that we have created our one of all right. So now that we have created one useful endpoint for our blog backend, let's take some time to make our lives a little bit easier going forward and see how we can avoid having to manually restart our server every time we make a change to our code. So there is an npm package that does this for us, and it's called nodemon. So let's just install it, which we can do by stopping our server, and we're going to say npm install nodemon. But one last thing that we are going to do is we are going to add the save dev flag when we install this, because this package is only going to be used in development. We are not going to use this in production, as we'll see in a little bit later on when we release our app. So let's hit enter, and that's going to install that package for us. And once it installs, all we have to do is change the command that we used to run our server. Instead of saying node source slash server.js, we can say npx nodemon source slash server.js. npx here is a command that you can use to run command line scripts such as nodemon that you have installed locally into your project instead of globally. So let's hit enter here, and what we're going to see is that it prints out some output here, and then we see our regular message of server is listening at port 8000. All right. So if you go back and test this now, let's just send a post request to API/articles/landlord upload. If we click send, sure enough, we'll see that that still works. And notice, by the way, that every time our server restarts, as I said, it sets the upvotes back to 0. So we see that that still works. But now if we go and make a change to our server.js file, all right, so let's go into our upvote endpoint, and maybe let's say something like, instead of success, we'll say hooray. All right, so you'll see that as soon as you save that file, it automatically detects that something has changed and restarts our server for us. And this is very, very helpful in server-side development to have that kind of automatic reloading functionality. So, and if we go back to Postman and click send now, we'll see that that has automatically taken effect, those changes that we made. So let's actually change this back to success because I like that better. We'll be modifying this endpoint a little bit more later on anyway, but we'll see that when we change that back, it restarts our server automatically once again. And if we click send, it's going to change back to success. So one last thing that's going to make our lives easier here is if we go into our package.json file, and in order to avoid having to remember that new command npx node source slash server.js, what we can actually do is define a custom script, which we can call something like dev. I'm going to call it dev here. That will run that thing for us. Now, so what we're going to do is to this script property, we are going to add a property dev. And after that, we are just going to say npx nodemon source slash server.js. And now what we can do if you save your file is we can simply run npm run and then the name of that script, which is dev, and that will run that command that we specified for that for us automatically. So you won't need to remember the exact command here. You'll just need to remember that you need to run npm run dev in order to start up our application in development mode. So let's just test that one last time. We'll click send and it's working just like it was before. So that is how to use nodemon to automatically restart our server whenever we make changes to it. So now that we have got our server updating automatically and we've implemented upvote functionality for our articles, another common feature that we will want to implement for our backend for a blog site is the ability to add comments. So what we are going to do here is just like how we had this upvotes property, we are going to add a comments property to all of our articles that will simply be an empty array, at least to start holding all of the comments that users have added. So we are just going to say comments, comments, and comments for all of these. And now that we have done that, the next thing that we are going to do is we're going to create another endpoint here. This endpoint will allow users to add comments to an article. So first of all, this endpoint's going to be a post endpoint, since we'll be creating something namely comments. And the path here is going to start with slash API, just like our upvote endpoint. And then it's going to have slash articles slash colon name. We have that route parameter in there. And then we are going to say slash comments. And that should be all we need to do for that part. So now for the callback, this is sometimes referred to as a route handler, this function. What we are going to do is pretty much the same thing as what we did in our upvote endpoint. We're going to find the corresponding article for that name parameter, and we're going to add a comment to it. Now, in order to implement this endpoint, we're going to use a request body to carry the data that we want for the comment. So let's actually go back to Postman before we implement this endpoint and decide what we want that to look like. So we're going to first of all change the URL here to slash comments instead of slash upvote. And then we're going to open the body tab and go to raw and then select JSON from the dropdown. And let's decide what we want this request body to look like. Really, all that we need to have is two properties. One, specifying the person who posted the article. So we'll say posted by, and I'm going to just say Sriara here. And then we'll say text, and this will be the actual text of the comment. So we'll say something like awesome article. Cool. So now that we have done that, and by the way, you could always add extra properties to these comments here, such as adding the ability to upvote or downvote comments if you want, but I'll leave that up to you. But now that we know what the request body is going to look like, we can go back to our IDE and implement this thing. So the first thing we are going to do, of course, is we're going to get the request name from route parameters saying const name equals request dot params dot name. And if you wanted to shorten this up a little bit, you could always use object destructuring and say const name in curly braces equals request params. And then for the request body, we're going to say const and get the posted by and the text properties from request dot body. All right. So now that we have both of these, we're going to find the corresponding article just like we did up here in our upvote endpoint. So in fact, I'm going to copy this here and paste it. And we can also, instead of saying request.params.name, we can just say name right here in order to shorten that up a little bit. And now we can just say article.comments.push. And we are going to push a new comment onto there with the posted by and text properties that we got from the request body inside of it. And the last thing here, we have to decide how we want this endpoint to respond to the client. So the easiest path to take here going forward is going to be just respond with the updated article info. So in fact, we'll want to rewrite our upvote endpoint to do this as well. So here is what this is going to look like. We're going to say response dot, and instead of saying send, which is generally used just for any kind of text-based data, such as saying hello, we're going to actually say response dot JSON, which is used to send back a JSON object as part of the response. So just like how requests can have request bodies, responses can have response bodies. And we're going to say response.json and we'll send back that uploaded article like so. All right. And then we'll do the same thing for this upvote endpoint up here. Instead of saying response send, blah, 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 we're going to replace this line by saying response.json with the updated article. So let's test that out now. What we're going to do is go back to Postman. Our server restarted automatically using node mon, which we added previously. And we're going to send this post request to slash API articles learn node slash comments. And if we click send, what we'll see is our updated article, which now has this new comment added to it. And we can always add something else too. We'll just say Sriara, and then we'll say something like I agree. And if we click send, we'll see that that adds the extra comment as well. And let's just test up voting now. We'll just send a post request now to slash upvote instead of slash comments. We don't need to request, we don't need a request body for this. So let's just select none. And if we click send here, we'll see that that'll increment the number of upvotes there. Cool. So that is how to implement a comments endpoint. So at this point, our server's working pretty well. But once again, there is that problem of if our server restarts, we know that all of our data is going to be reset. So the next thing that we are going to see how to do is persist our data by using a database. At this point, we have a pretty fully functional front end and back end for our blog site. So the next thing that we need to do is persist our data. And for our application, it makes sense to persist our data in a database that plays very nicely with JavaScript. So, and for that, we need to look no further than MongoDB. Now, MongoDB is what we call a non-relational database, which means that we can basically just push data into it from our JavaScript code without worrying about how the data is formatted. So now, in the case of MongoDB, we can basically just hand our database any kind of JSON object, that we wanted to store, and we can retrieve them later whenever we need them. Now, this is in contrast to traditional relational databases where the structure of the data in the fields it contains have to be generally be defined in advance and adhere to whenever we add new data. Now, working with relational databases also generally requires some knowledge of SQL. And so by using MongoDB, which is non-relational, there is no need to learn any other programming languages. And this allows us to keep our full stack application using only JavaScript. Now, one last bonus of using MongoDB is that it's open source and relatively easy to set up and easy to use. So as you'll see, it's going to be pretty easy to add to our server also. So now that we know some of the benefits of MongoDB, let's see how to add this to our Express application. So before we can get started adding MongoDB to our application, we need to actually install it locally. After installing, we're going to open MongoDB Compass and create a database called Full Stack React DB. You can choose whatever name you want to use here, but just make sure that if you do change the name, you actually change that string that we type in later on when we are connecting to the database on our server. And we are going to create a collection with a name articles. Now we are actually just going to open up our server file, server.js, and we are going to scroll up to where we had this article info defined. We're going to copy that array, including the square brackets, and paste that in the add data pop-up here. What this means is that we successfully inserted these JavaScript objects into MongoDB. Collections in MongoDB are like what tables are in SQL-based databases. Just collections of related or similar items. Now that we have our MongoDB set up, let's see how we can add it to our server. Now that we have got MongoDB up and running locally, let's see how we can incorporate it into our Express server. Now, the first thing that we are going to do is we are going to install the MongoDB package into our project. And this is the library or driver that will allow us to connect to MongoDB from inside a Node.js server. And we are going to do this by opening up our terminal and make sure that you are inside the backend directory. You might not be if you just opened up a new terminal. Now we are going to run npm install MongoDB. So this is again the MongoDB driver. And once that's installed, we can use this package to connect to and modify our local database from inside our Express server code. So previously we added the data here in our articles info array to a database called full stack React DB. So now that our data is saved there, we no longer need to define it here. And instead of deleting it, I'm just going to leave that around so that I don't break these endpoints. But once we get these endpoints to be switched into, or but once we get these endpoints switched over to use MongoDB instead, but once we get these endpoints switched over to use MongoDB instead of this in-memory database, you'll actually see that the syntax highlighting will make the name of this thing grayed out, meaning we no longer have need of it. So we'll be able to delete it then. So in order to get started here, the first thing that we are going to do is we're actually going to create a new endpoint that will allow us to simply load the data for one of our articles without modifying it. Currently, we have two other endpoints that allow us to add upvotes or add comments, but we want the ability to just see what the comments and upvotes are for a given article. So here is what that's going to look like. We're going to start off by saying app.get, and for the path here, we are just going to say /API/articles/:name. And now we are going to say request and response, and inside here, we're going to connect to MongoDB and make the MongoDB queries. So first of all, let's actually get the name of the article. We'll say const name equals request.params. We're getting it from that route parameters there. And then we're going to import something up at the top called Mongo client. All right, so import Mongo client from MongoDB, that library that we just installed. And additionally, we are going to import something else called server API version that we'll use to create a new instance of this Mongo client thing. Cool. So next down here in our load article endpoint that we just created, we are going to create a new instance of that Mongo client thing, which will enable us to connect to MongoDB. So here is what this is going to look like. We are going to start off by defining the URI of the database we want to connect to, and then we are going to say const client equals MongoDB colon / 127.0.0.1 colon 27017. And by the way, this value is going to be different depending on whether you are connecting to MongoDB locally or connecting to a remote MongoDB server. And then we are going to say const client equals new MongoDB client, new Mongo client. And then we're going to say const client equals new Mongo client, that thing that we just imported up above. We are going to pass the URI as the first argument, and the second argument here, we're going to pass a settings object with server API as the first argument, and then version is going to be server API version dot v1. We're going to set strict to true, and we're going to set deprecation errors to true. These are just basic pieces of setup, so don't worry too much about what's going on here. So next, now that we have this client thing created, we need to tell it to actually connect to the MongoDB instance, which we are going to do by saying await client.connect. And since that's an asynchronous function, we need to add the async keyword to our route handler here. And now that we have connected, the next thing we are going to do is we're going to say we're going to get a reference to our full stack React DB that we created through the MongoDB Compass by saying const db equals client.db, and then we're going to use the name here. Make sure that this is the same one that you used previously, or it won't have any data in it. And that should be all we need to do. So next, we are going to make a query to the database that we just connected to by saying const article equals await db dot collection of articles, and then what we're going to do is say dot find, and actually since we're only searching for a single article here by name, we're going to use find one, and then we're going to say find one. This will be what we want to search for, and this will be we want to search for the product by name, and that should give us the article that we are looking for. So let's just send this back to the client. What we are going to do here is we're going to say response.json of article. That should send it back. So let's test this thing out. What we're going to do is go back to Postman and send a GET request to /API/articles/learn node. And if we click send, we should see that. We have this learn node article info loaded from the database. And you can tell that it's from the database because it has this extra little ID property here that's added automatically by MongoDB. So let's try loading some other articles. We'll try loading learn React, and if we click send, it loads that one as well. Cool. So at this point, we have MongoDB incorporated into our server, at least in a single endpoint. So the next thing that we are going to do is go through the other endpoints and add it there as well. So now that we have connected our server to MongoDB, the next thing that we are going to do is rewrite our other two endpoints so that they use MongoDB instead of the in-memory article info or array that we are using. So we'll start off here with the upvote endpoint. And really the first thing that we need to do here is figure out a more efficient way of connecting to MongoDB. We don't want to have to copy and paste all of these lines of code into each and every endpoint. So essentially what we are going to do is we're just going to make our server connect to MongoDB outside of any individual endpoint here. And we'll just refer to the connection whenever we need to interact with the database. So here is what this is going to look like. We're just going to take the URI all the way through await client connect and db equals client db. We're going to cut these and we are going to create a function here that will be called something like connect to db. So here we'll say function connect to db, and inside here is where we are going to paste those lines of code. And this will need to be an async function here, of course, because it has the await keyword inside of it. At last but not least, what we need to do is store this connection in an external variable. So we'll just say let db, and that will just be undefined at first, and then we are just going to say db equals client.db. Cool. So now in order to make this work, all we need to do is make sure that we call connect to db before we start up our server. So here is what it's going to look like. We're just going to create an asynchronous function. So here we'll say async function, and we'll call it something like start. And then inside here, we're just going to say await connect to db. And after that, we'll say app.listen. All right. So we'll just add that down here and we'll leave that the way that it was before. And now, last thing, we just need to say start and actually call that function in order to connect to the database and start up our server. So now that we have done that, we should be able to just use db whenever we need to do something. So down here, for example, in our get article endpoint, we can just refer directly to the db by saying await db.collection, and that's using the external variable that we created up here. So let's do the same thing with upvote now. With upvote, this one's going to be a little bit trickier query wise because we're actually going to be modifying a document in the database. So what we need to do here is basically just remove everything. We're going to start fresh inside this endpoint because even though the logic is going to follow a similar format, it's going to be different enough that we might as well start with an empty function here. And what this is going to look like is we're going to say await db.collection of articles, just like we did in the previous endpoint. And then instead of saying dot find one, there is actually a function called update one, which will allow us to modify a document in the database. And since we also want to return the updated document by saying response.json of article, there is actually a special query function for that case as well called find one and update. All right. And here, while I'm thinking of this, let's make that an asynchronous function since we are using the await keyword. And here is what this is going to look like. For find one and update, we have to start off by finding the article by its name, which we can do by looking at the name route parameter. So we're just going to say const name equals request dot params. And now that we have that, we're going to say find one and update. We're going to find the article whose name matches the name route parameter. And then the second argument, we are going to pass here is going to be an object specifying changes we want to make to that document. This one uses a special syntax that's unique to MongoDB. What we are going to do is we are going to say $inc, that stands for increment, and we're going to increment the upwards by 1. And we can say that by saying upwards 1. All right. So that's again MongoDB's unique syntax for incrementing a property. We just use the $inc thing. We tell it what property we want to increment and we tell it how much we want to increment it by. Cool. And the last thing that we need to pass here is a sort of settings object that will tell MongoDB when we want to return the document that we are finding. So do we want to return it before we update it or do we want to return it after we update it? In our case, we want to return it after. So for that, we just need to say return document and the value of for that is going to be after. So in other words, we want to return the document so that we can assign it to a variable after the update. So we are just going to say const updated article equals await db.collection and etc. And then we can send that back by saying response.json of updated article. So let's give this thing a try. We're going to do what we're going to do is first of all make sure our server is still running. Yep, it looks like it's still running there. So let's give this thing a try by going over to Postman. We're going to send a post request to articles / learn react / upvote. And if we click send here, we should see that sure enough, we get this article sent back with its upvotes incremented by 1. And the interesting part about this now is that even after our server restarts, the upvotes and the comments will be persisted since we are using a MongoDB database. That's again one of the major benefits of using a database over just using an in-memory array as we were doing previously. So now that we have rewritten our upvote endpoint to use MongoDB, let's do the same thing with our comments endpoint. So again, with our comments endpoint, we'll pretty much start over. We're just going to remove the last few lines here. We'll keep the request params and request body things around because that will be very helpful. So now what we're going to do is we are going to say await db.collection of articles, just like we did before. And then we're going to use that same find one and update function in order to make our change as well as return the updated article. And we are going to find it by name again, just like we did in our upvote endpoint, except instead of saying increment with the $sign like we did for upvotes, we're going to say $push. Because what we want to do here is we want to actually add a new comment onto the comments array of our article. So here is what that's going to look like. We're going to say $sign push, and we're going to say that we want to push something onto the comments array, and that something is going to be the new comment. And just to make this absolutely clear, let's say const new comment equals posted by and text. And now that we have that, we're just going to say comments. We want to push new comment. The order there is a little bit strange, but that's basics of how that works. So the last thing we need to do is, just like with our upvote endpoint, we need to say return document after. Let's also add the async keyword to our handler and say const updated article equals await db.collection, etc. Cool. So let's just send that thing back to the client by saying response.json of updated article. And now that we have done that, let's test this thing out. So we're going to go back to Postman here and send a post request to slash comments after the article that we want to edit. And we need to add a request body here. So let's just say posted by, and you can use your name and you can really write whatever you want for the text. I'm just going to say great article. And if we click send here, what we should see is that we get back the updated article, which now has a comment added to it. And again, just like with upvotes, even after our server restarts, this comments here and the upvotes will still be around. So our data is now successfully persisted in MongoDB, and since we have converted all of our endpoints, we should be able to see that up here. We are no longer using this article info array, so we can simply delete it. And that is how to convert an Express server to use MongoDB. Okay, so at this point, we have a working front end and a working backend, which we just created with Express and MongoDB. So now what we need to do is bring the front end and backend together using network requests. Essentially, what we want to do is have our front end make requests to our backend in a very similar way to how we have been making requests to the backend using Postman. The main difference is that the front end will be allowing the user to do this automatically by doing things like clicking buttons, adding comments, things like that. Now, there are many libraries that we can use in order to load data from the backend in React, but the one that we are going to use here is called axios. So what you want to do is open up a terminal and we're going to install axios into the front end, and then we're going to run npm install axios. So that will install that library for us, and that should be all that we need to do to get started. So we'll see how to actually use this library to make network requests to different URLs now. So now that we have installed Axios, let's see how we can actually load data for the different routes in our React application. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to open up the front end application again. We haven't been in here a little while. So, but we're going to go into app.jsx and take a look at the routes array that we created inside of there. Now, remember that what this routes array did is it defined what component were. Now, remember that what this routes array did is it defined what component, what page component should be displayed for each part. So we had this surrounding layout component that basically was in charge of displaying the nav bar, and then we had the home page, about page, articles list page, and article page. So what we need to do here in order to load data for one of these pages is we actually just need to specify another property in one of these objects. And that is a property called loader. Now, the way that this works is we simply need to specify a function for this loader property that will load whatever data this component needs from the server. So here is what this is going to look like. We are going to define this function, which by the way needs to be an asynchronous function because we are going to be making a network request, which is an asynchronous operation. And inside here, what we are going to do is we are going to send a request by saying axios await axios.get. Now we just installed the axios library. So in order to be able to use axios.get, we need to import it up at the top here by saying import axios from axios. So now that we have that, let's go back down and we are going to say await axios.get. And we need to specify the URL that we want to make this request to. Now, the URL here is a little bit tricky to get right because the temptation is to just find out whatever port the backend is running on and try and send a request to that. So we might want to try just copying this URL and sending it there. However, we're going to run into some problems if we try things this way because of something called a CORS error. CORS, CORS. So we are going to avoid doing that. And instead, what we are going to do is make our front end and back end think that they are running on the same origin, the same port and URL. So, all right. Now, this is actually going to be a really, and all right. Now, this is actually going to be a reality when we publish our application. What we are just going to have a we are just going to have a single server that serves both our front end and our backend. So what we are going to do here for the URL is we are simply going to say axios.get and we are going to say /API/articles and then slash, and for now we are just going to say learn node. All right, we'll see how to actually get the name for the article that we want to load here shortly. But that's all we need to do for now. And again, that's going to send this type of request, a get request to this part. So let's get the response here. We are going to say const response equals await axios dot get. And now that we have that, we are going to get the response body, which as we know is going to contain the data for that article, such as the upvotes and the comments by saying const article data equals response.data. Okay, and now we simply need to return that by saying return. And what we can actually do here is pass the upvotes and the comments separately, which will make it easier to get at those inside the page component as we'll see. So here is what this is going to look like. Instead of saying const article data, we're just going to say const, and then we're going to say that we want the upvotes as well as the comments. And then what we're going to do is say return upvotes and comments. Now you might be wondering why it is that we are returning this as an object. Well, basically what we can do now is we can go into our article page and access these things by using a special React hook. So that's what we are going to see how to do next by using a React hook called use loader data. All right, so now that we have added this loader for our article page route, the next thing that we need to do is actually go into that page and use a React hook in order to access the data that we have written, these upvotes and comments. So here is what this is going to look like. We are going to go into our article page component. So let's just open that up here, pages, article page.jsx. And now we're going to import another hook besides use params from React router DOM. That's going to be called use loader data. All right, so here is how this works. It's actually pretty simple. Whatever we returned from the loader function in our route definitions, we can access simply by saying const data equals use loader data. Now, in our case, since that loaded data was the comments and upvotes in an object, we can actually just use object restructuring here to say upvotes and comments equals use loaded data. And let's just try displaying these. We'll just display them right underneath our article title. Actually, let's get started here just by displaying our upvotes. We'll just say something like this article has upvotes, and we'll just leave our comments for the time being. We will come back for those. It's just that it takes a lot longer to create the basic structure to display them. So let's give this a try. The first thing that we are going to do, of course, is run our front end and make sure, by the way, that your backend is also running. All right, so we are going to go into our front end directory and make sure that we are in front end over here on the right hand side. All we are going to do, and we're going to run npm, and we're going to run npm run dev, and that should start our front end again. So let's go over to the browser, and if we go to articles, and we can really just click on any of these articles which is here, what we'll see is that, oh, it looks like that didn't work. Now, you should right click and go to inspect, and then go to the network tab here, and you may need to hit refresh in order to see this. If you select fetch XHR, that will show you the lead. If you select fetch XHR, that will show you the learn node request that was made by our front end application. Now, one thing to notice here is that it's not going to the right URL. So this is the URL for our front end. Now, the reason it did this, let's just go back to our IDE here. The reason it did this is because inside that loader, we didn't specify the full URL. Now, remember that I said earlier is that in order to make our front end and back end think that they are on the same origin, we need to set up something called a proxy. So the way that we do this by creating React apps with read is by going into this read.config.js file in our front end. We are going to add something to this little defined config object that it has. And here is what that's going to look like. We're going to say server. All right. This is going to be an object of its own. Then we're going to say proxy, which is also going to be another object. And then we are going to have a property called /API, whose value is also going to be another object. So we've got a fairly nested object here, but just bear with me. Inside this API object, we are going to say target. And here is what we need to get the URL for our server. So let's actually add the value localhost 8000 as the value for that target. Now, what we are going to do is add change origin now and say true. And that should be all we need to do here in order to make this work. Now, you may have to restart your front end. It's usually just a good idea to do that to make sure that those changes take effect. So let's open up our front end again. And what we should see now is if we go to any of our article pages, it will display this article has, and then it will actually have a number in there. And if you open up the inspect window again and go to network, and let's just hit refresh here, you'll see that it actually shows the request that our page is sending to our server. So if you take a look at the response here, we are getting the learn node article with 0 upvotes and no comments. Now this is just because we hard-coded learn node into our loader, as you may recall. If we go back into our app.jsx and take a look at the loader here, we hard-coded learn node. So the next thing we want to do is actually incorporate the article ID or name into this request that we are sending. So now that our frontend is successfully loading article data from our server, the last thing that we really need to do in order to make sure that it's the right data is replace this hard-coded name for the article with whatever the route parameter happens to be that we are currently using or currently visiting. So essentially, we want to take this name parameter and insert in into this string. We can just add a single prop here called params to our function, our loader function that we are defining, and React will automatically pass these params such as name to our function. So all we have to do now is take away this learn node thing, and onto the end of this, we are going to say plus param start name, and that should be all we really need to do here. So let's just check and make sure that this works. And first of all, we know that our Learn React article already has some upvotes. So we'll test that one just to make sure it's working there. So let's open up our front end in a tab and we'll try this again. We're going to go back into our article space and we'll go to our React article. And we see that it displays one upvote instead of zero. So let's go back to our node server. That one should be one should still be zero, and our MongoDB one should still be zero because we haven't touched those yet. But we can also make sure by taking a look at our inspector window, going to network and refreshing our page, and we should see now that it's loading it from the correct path, and we are getting the correct article back. And if we go back to articles and our node article, we'll see that that loads the node. And for MongoDB, we see that that loads the MongoDB article data. So the last thing that we're going to do here is, in order to make our application a little bit more modular, it's usually a good idea for these loaders to actually export them as part of the page file. So what this is going to look like is we are actually just going to take this async function, we are going to cut it, and we are going to go into our article page and export that by saying export function, and then we're going to call this something like loader, and then we'll paste our function here, and this does need to be an async function, so let's add the async keyword. And now what we can do is we can simply load this loader function or import this loader function rather into our app.jsx and pass it in. But let's actually import axios into this file just to make sure we have that imported. So we'll say import axios from axios. And now we can go back to our app.jsx, and along with our article page, we're also going to import the loader, and we can rename that by saying as article loader. And now we can just go down here and pass article loader as the loader instead of having our function defined in place. So in other words, what we are doing here is we are just putting all of the logic that belongs together in the same file. If you want to know how the article page is getting its data, we can just look at the loader function. So anyway, that is how to load all of the article data for our individual articles. So the next thing that we are going to do is work on comments and upvotes and integrate them a little bit more into our front end. So now that our article page is correctly loading information about the articles that it displays, the next step for us is to build a new component to display the comments for our articles. So what we're going to do is we are going to go over here into our front end directory, and we are just going to create a new component here. We'll say new file, and we'll call this comments list.jsx. All right. So inside here, it's going to be pretty straightforward. We just need to say export default function, and we are going to call this comments list, just like the name of the file. And this is going to take a single prop called comments. Now, all that we need to do here is have our article page display this component and pass the comments that it loaded from our server as a prop to this thing. So let's just create a simple interface here that displays those comments. Here is what this is going to look like. We're just going to say in a React fragment, h3, that's going to be our heading comments. And now underneath this, we are going to loop through our comments and display the same structure for each of them. So here is what that's going to look like. We're just going to say comments.map, and for each comment, we're going to display a div, and this is going to have a key. We can just use the comment.text for this. So we'll say comment.text, and that does assume, of course, that the text is going to be unique. So if there are two comments that share the same text, that could cause problems, but we could always add a unique ID to these comments in MongoDB if you want to. We'll just skip over that part for now. And inside here, for each of these comments, we're just going to have an H3 heading that displays the person that posted the comment. So we'll just say comment.posted by, and underneath this, we're going to say paragraph, and this is going to be comment.text. So that should be all we really need to do here. And once again, we're going to ignore the ESLint errors here, saying that we need to do props validation. Just in the interest of time, we are going to leave this the way it is. And now that we have our comments list, let's go back to our article page, and we're going to import the comments list component by saying import comments list from comments list. Now down here underneath the article content, we're going to see the comments list. And what we're going to do here is we're just going to say comments equals comments. We're going to display the comments that we loaded from our server. So let's give this thing a try. Now we're going to go back over to our application running in the browser. And we actually don't have any comments for MongoDB. So the only one that we have comments for is our Learn React article. So let's click on that, and we see that underneath there it says great article. Now feel free to add any extra styling you want onto this. Now feel free to add any extra styling you want to this. If you want to have like divider lines, things like that, but I'm just going to leave it the way it is for now. So now that our front end is loading its data from our server, the next thing that we need to do is allow our front end to make other types of requests to our server, such as requests for upvoting an article. So what we're going to do here is we're going to add an upvote button to our article page, and we're going to need that button to make a request to our server when it's clicked. That will tell our server to upvote the article. And we also need to update the interface here to reflect the new upvote count. So here is what this is going to look like. We're going to start off by adding a button next to this message. And let's actually just put a button right here above our message that says how many upvotes the article has. And we're going to say something like upvote. And we'll also give this button an on-click prop, which is just going to be a function that will be called when this button is clicked. And we'll call this something like on upvote clicked. So we're just going to define a function there called that. This is going to be an async function too, of course. So we'll say async function on upvote click. And inside here now, by the way, let's just pass this to the on click prop. So on upvote clicked, inside this function now, we are going to use the axios library to make a request, but instead of making a get request by saying axios.get, we are going to say axios.post, which will make a post request to the URL of our choice. And that URL should be something like /api/articles. And then we're going to need the article parameter there, the name parameter, which we have up here. So we'll just say plus name, and then we're going to say /upvote. And that should make a request to that endpoint for us. So let's just say const response equals await axios.post. And now we should be able to get the updated upvote count from this response by saying const updated article data equals response.data. And in order to update the upvotes count, we need to do something a little bit interesting here. We actually need to import the use state hook from React, which is used to keep track of component state. And here is what we have to do. After we have the upvotes and comments from our loaded data, we are actually going to set the upvotes as the initial value for a state. So we'll actually rename upvotes here to something like initial upvotes, and we'll rename comments as well to initial comments. And now what we're going to do is we're going to say const upvotes and set upvotes equals, and we'll use that use state hook that we just imported. And as the initial state, we are just going to pass initial upvotes. And that should be all we need to do there. So now that we have this state, all we need to do is after we update the number of upvotes by making that request, we are just going to call set upvotes. And we are going to set that to the updated number of upvotes by saying updated article data dot upvotes. Actually, let's change this initial comments thing back to comments for now, just so that it doesn't break our interface down here where we say comments. So let's head back to our browser, and what we should see is that we have this upvote button now. So let's try clicking it. And if all goes well, we should see that this thing increases to 2 upvotes. So let's give it a try. We're going to click it, and that increases to 2 upvotes. And furthermore, if we refresh our page, we'll see that this is still there. The data is now persisted in MongoDB. So that is how to implement a simple upvote button. The next thing that we are going to do is see how to do that same kind of thing for adding comments to articles in our application. So now that we have added the ability to upvote articles to our application, the last thing that we are going to do is add an add comment form that will let users comment on articles. So here is what this is going to look like. We're going to go into our frontend directory, and inside source, we're going to create a new file called add comment form.jsx. And inside here, we are just going to create a simple component called add comment form. So we'll say export default function add comment form. And here is what this is going to look like. We're actually going to have a single prop passed to add comment form called on add comment. And that's going to basically be a function that our page will pass down to it in order to allow our page to be the one that handles that and makes the request. So that just makes things a little bit easier going forward, as you'll see. So as far as the elements that this component is going to display, here is what this is going to look like. We're going to just put all of this inside a div, and then we're going to have an H3 heading at the top that says add a comment. And after that, what we are going to do is we are going to add 2 inputs, one for entering the name and one for entering the actual text of the comments. So here is what this looks like. We're going to say label, and inside that label, we'll say name, and then we'll say input type equals text. And then what we are going to do is copy and paste this for the text of the comment. So let's just adjust the indentation there, and we'll just say comment for this label. And then we are going to add a button that will say something like add comment. And when this button is clicked, we want it to call this on add comment function with the values in both of these text inputs. So here is what that's going to look like. We're just going to say on click equals, and we're going to need a little bit more logic here before this will work. We'll just say on add comment for now, and we'll now, in order to keep track of the values inside both of these text inputs, we need to add some state to this component. So let's start off by importing the use state hook from the app, just like we did in our article page to keep track of the upvotes and comments. And now for the state, we're going to say const, and we'll have the name text. We'll just say name text and set name text equals use state. And the initial value for that will be an empty string. And then we'll do the same thing for the comment text. We'll say comment text and set comment text equals use state. And the initial value for that is going to be an empty string as well. Cool. So now that we have got these two state variables, we just need to bind them to these inputs. So we're going to do that by saying value equals name text, and then for on change, we are going to say that we want to call set name text with the new value of the text inside of it, which we can get by saying e dot target dot value. And we'll do the same thing now for our comment text. We're going to say value equals comment text, then on change equals e dot set comment text to the target value, and that is all we need to do there, except of course call on add comment with name text and comment text. We can do that just by passing it like this. We'll say name text and comment text, and that should be all we need to do there. So let's go back to our article page, and we are going to use that add comment form. First of all, we'll need to import it by saying import add comment form from its file. And now we'll go down and underneath our comments list, or maybe above our comments list, to encourage users to add comments, because that's what they will see first. We'll say add comment form, and we are going to pass on add comment, and we can define our own function here, just like we did for this upvote button. What we are going to do is we're going to say on add comment, and we'll define our own version of that function up here underneath on upvote clicked. We're going to say async function on add comment, and we're going to do something pretty similar to what we did inside this on upvote clicked function here, except we're going to be making that request to another endpoint, and we need to include the name text and the comment text as part of the request body. So here is how this is going to work. First of all, we need to change this to slash comments here. And then in order to pass a request body, all we need to do is add a second argument to this, which is going to be a JavaScript object. And we're going to say that we want to post by. If you take a look at our server.js endpoint again, just to verify this, we see that we have posted by and text. So we just need to change those properties a little bit in our requests that we are making. So let's go back to our article page, and now we can say posted by. That's going to be name text. And for the text, that's going to be comment text. And that should be all we need to do there, except of course update the comments. So let's do the same thing with the comments as what we did with our upvotes. We're going to rename comments here to initial comments. We're going to add another state variable called comments and set comments like so. Then we'll say equals use state initial comments. And now we just need to call set comments with the updated comments inside our on add comment function. And we need to set that to updated article data dot comments. Cool. So that should be all we need to do there. Let's give this thing a try. We're just going to go back to our app running in the browser here. You see our form. It's not the prettiest form in the world, but again, I'll leave it up to you to please type that yourself. So I'm going to say Shreya. We'll say Shreya 2 for the name. And then for the comment, we'll say something like, I agree. This is a wonderful article. All right, so let's try clicking add comment now. And what should happen if everything goes well? Yes, we should see another comment appear underneath this one here. So let's click add comment and we'll see that comment. One last thing we might want to do is clear out these two text boxes after we click on the add comment button. So let's go back to our IDE. And in order to do that, we can say inside add comment form, we'll just adjust this anonymous function that we are using here so that after calling on add comment, we just say set name text to an empty string. And then we're going to set the comment text to an empty string as well. So let's just try that one here. We need to go back to our app in the browser again. And here, let's just refresh the page there. And now let's just say something like someone else. And for the comment, we'll say, I like it too. And if we click add comment, we'll see that that clears out these things out and adds that comment onto the end of that comments list. Cool. So at this point, we have a fully functional full stack application. Well, congratulations. We have covered a lot of ground in this course. And the first thing I want to do is thank you for joining me on this journey. By now, we have gained some incredibly valuable skills in full stack React development, including building front end with React, building backends with Node.js and Express, and of course, adding database functionality with MongoDB as well. So now that the course is over, you are probably wondering where to go next. Well, what I would recommend is that you take this opportunity while everything is still fresh in your mind to solidify your knowledge by building your own full stack projects. So if there is some full stack project you have been dreaming of building, get started on it right now. And also, if you have any questions or want to share your progress, feel free to post in the comments section. And finally, if you are looking for other courses, I'd highly recommend checking out some of my other courses in our channel, including courses on working in the React ecosystem, software architecture, and design patterns with React, and so much more. So keep coding, keep learning. Best of luck in your projects.